Y'all, I'm sitting here at gate B47 at Denver International Airport, and honey, my whole world just came crashing down like a house of cards in a tornado. My son Michael just walked away from me. Actually, walked away after telling me to wait right here in this plastic chair while they go handle some family emergency that apparently doesn't include his own mother. 8 hours I've been sitting in the same spot, watching planes take off and land, watching families hug their loved ones, while I'm here alone with nothing but my purse and the growing realization that my own flesh and blood might have just abandoned me at 73 years old. Let me back up and tell you how I got here because, sweetie, this story is going to make your blood boil and your heart break all at the same time. My name's Dorothy, but everyone calls me Dot, and I've been living in Phoenix for the past 15 years in my little retirement community. It's nothing fancy, mind you, but it's mine, and I've got my morning coffee group and my weekly bridge club, and I thought I was living my golden years just fine, thank you very much. But apparently, my family had other plans for old Grandma Dot. It all started 3 weeks ago when my daughter-in-law Susan called me up, sweet as pie, telling me how much they missed me and how they wanted me to come visit for Thanksgiving. Now, y'all should know that Susan has never been my biggest fan. She's one of those women who thinks a mother-in-law is competition instead of family, but she sounded so sincere on the phone. She said the grandkids had been asking about me, and wouldn't it be wonderful if Grandma could come stay for a whole month this time? Maybe even through Christmas. Honey, I should have known something was fishy when she offered to pay for my plane ticket. Susan counting pennies like they're extinct, and suddenly she's offering me to fly first class from Phoenix to Denver. But I was so excited about seeing my grandbabies that I ignored every red flag waving in my face like surrender banners. The flight was beautiful, I'll give them that. First class, just like Susan promised, with a nice meal and a glass of wine that made me feel fancy. I spent the whole 2 hours planning what I'd do with little Emma and Josh. Maybe take them to the zoo or teach Emma how to make my famous chocolate chip cookies. I had a whole bag packed with presents I've been collecting all year. Little things I thought they'd love. When I landed at DEN, Michael was right there waiting for me with the biggest smile, looking so handsome in his business suit. He hugged me tight and asked about my flight, carried my suitcase like the gentleman I raised him to be. We chatted about everything and nothing on the drive to their house in Lakewood. He told me about his promotion at the insurance company. I told him about Mrs. Henderson's new boyfriend at the retirement home. Everything felt normal, felt right. But the minute we pulled into their driveway, I knew something was wrong. Susan came out to meet us, but her smile looked painted on like those department store mannequins. And the kids, my precious grandkids, they barely looked up from their phones when I walked in. Emma, who used to run to me screaming Grandma Dot, just gave me this little wave and mumbled something about homework. Before I tell you what happened next, and honey, this part is going to absolutely shock you. If you're loving this story, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. You know I get so excited when I see y'all in the comments. Speaking of which, what state are you calling home right now? Drop it down below. And sweetie, tell me, have you ever had family treat you like you didn't matter? Because your stories help me know I'm not alone in this crazy world. Now, let me tell you what I discovered next, because what they did was about to backfire in the most beautiful way. That first week was the strangest week of my life, y'all. Every morning I'd get up early like I always do, make coffee for everyone, and try to start conversations with my own family. But it was like I was invisible. Michael would rush off to work without barely a goodbye. Susan would disappear for hours at a time, claiming she had errands or yoga classes or book club meetings. The kids treated me like furniture, polite enough when they had to acknowledge me, but mostly acting like I wasn't even there. I tried everything I could think of to connect with them. I offered to cook Thanksgiving dinner. Susan said they were having it catered. I suggested taking the kids shopping for Christmas presents. They said the kids were too busy with school activities. I asked if I could help with anything around the house. Susan told me just to relax and enjoy my vacation. But honey, how are you supposed to enjoy a vacation when you feel like a stranger in your own son's house? The breaking point came on my second Thursday there. I was sitting in the living room trying to work on a crossword puzzle when I heard voices coming from the kitchen. Susan and Michael were talking in those hushed tones people use when they're discussing something they don't want others to hear. But y'all, these old ears work better than they think. "How much longer is she staying?" Susan was asking, and the irritation in her voice was sharper than broken glass. "She said she wanted to stay through Christmas," Michael replied. And honey, he sounded tired. Not happy tired from a good day's work, but tired like I was some kind of burden he was carrying around. Christmas is 6 weeks away, Michael. I can't do this for 6 more weeks. She's always in the kitchen when I want to cook. She tries to tell the kids stories they're not interested in. She rearranges things when she thinks she's being helpful. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells in my own house. I know. But she's my mom, Susan. What am I supposed to do? Just tell her to leave? Actually, yes, that's exactly what you're supposed to do. Or better yet, we could just help her transition to somewhere more appropriate for someone her age. Sweetie, those words hit me like a punch to the gut. Somewhere more appropriate for someone her age? I was 73, not 93, and I was living independently just fine, thank you very much. But the way she said it, like I was some kind of problem that needed to be solved, made me feel smaller than a gnat. I heard Michael sigh. One of those long, heavy sighs that says everything without saying anything. He said, "I'll figure something out." That night, I lay in their guest bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing faster than a greyhound at the track. What does Susan mean by help her transition? And why is my own son talking about me like I was a burden instead of his mother who had sacrificed everything to raise him right? The next few days, I started paying closer attention to things I'd missed before. Phone calls that got quieter when I walked into the room, conversations that stopped abruptly when I appeared, Susan spending an awful lot of time on her computer, looking at websites she'd quickly minimize when I got too close. And Michael, my sweet boy, avoiding eye contact with me like I was a guilty conscience he couldn't face. By the end of my 3rd week there, I knew they were planning something. But honey, I had no idea how low they were willing to go until that morning 2 days ago when Susan came to me with her brightest fake smile and told me they had a wonderful surprise planned for me.
Dot, she said. And I noticed she'd stopped calling me Mom weeks ago. Michael and I have been thinking about how much you've been missing your friends back in Phoenix. We know how important your independence is to you, and we found the perfect solution. She handed me a brochure for something called Sunset Manor, and y'all, my heart started pounding like a drum in a marching band. It was one of those assisted living facilities, all glossy photos of smiling elderly people playing bingo and sitting in wheelchairs looking content. The kind of place people go when their families can't be bothered to take care of them anymore. Now, we know what you're thinking, Susan continued, but this isn't just any facility. This is one of the most prestigious senior communities in Colorado. They have all sorts of activities, 3 meals a day, housekeeping services, and 24-hour medical care. You'd have your own apartment, but with all the support you need. I don't need support, I said.
and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. I live independently in Phoenix. I drive my own car. I cook my own meals. I take care of myself just fine. Michael finally spoke up from where he'd been lurking in the doorway like a guilty shadow. Mom, we just think it would be good for you to have people your own age around. Make some new friends. Have some structure in your day. I have friends, I said, and I could feel my voice starting to shake with a mixture of hurt and anger. I have Mrs. Peterson, who I have coffee with every Tuesday. I have my bridge club on Thursdays. I have a whole life back home. But Mom, Michael said, and there was something in his tone that made my stomach clench like a fist. We've already put a deposit down, and we've talked to your landlord in Phoenix. He's agreed to let us out of your lease early. Y'all, I swear I heard my world crack right down the middle like an egg hitting concrete. You did what? I whispered, because suddenly I couldn't get enough air into my lungs to speak properly. We were going to tell you differently, Susan said quickly, but we thought it would be easier if everything was already arranged. We've hired movers to pack up your apartment next week. Your things will be put in storage until you're settled at Sunset Manor, and then we can decide what you really need. I had no right, I said, and my voice was barely above a whisper. That's my home. Those are my things. You had no right to make decisions about my life without even asking me. Mom, you're 73 years old, Michael said, and he had the nerve to sound patient, like he was explaining something simple to a child. You can't live alone forever. What if you fall? What if you have a medical emergency? What if something happens to you and we don't know for days? Then that's my risk to take, I said, and suddenly I was standing up, my hands shaking with fury. I'm not dead yet. I'm not incompetent. I don't need you to manage my life like I'm a child who can't make her own decisions. But they'd already made up their minds, hadn't they? Every word out of their mouths was just them trying to convince me to go along with what they'd already decided. And when I kept saying no, when I kept insisting that I was going home to Phoenix, that I was going to call my landlord and tell him to ignore whatever they'd said, they exchanged one of those looks that made my blood turn cold. Mom, Susan said, and her voice had gone from fake sweet to ice-cold efficient. We're your family. We know what's best for you. And what's best is for you to be somewhere safe, somewhere you'll be taken care of, somewhere you won't be a danger to yourself or others. A danger? I repeated, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How am I a danger to anyone? You drove here from the airport, in traffic, at night. What if you gotten confused? What if you gotten lost? What if you caused an accident? I've been driving for 55 years. I've never had an accident. I've never even had a speeding ticket. But they weren't listening. They'd made up their minds, and nothing I said was going to change them. That night, I heard them on the phone with someone from Sunset Manor discussing my case, like I was a problem to be solved instead of a person with feelings and rights and a life of her own. The next morning, yesterday morning, they told me they were taking me the tour of the facility, just to look, Susan said, so you can see how nice it is, how happy you'll be there. I knew it wasn't just to look. I knew they were planning to leave me there. But what choice did I have? I couldn't get back to Phoenix without help. My apartment was apparently being packed up by strangers. My whole life was being dismantled while I sat helpless in their guest room. The drive to Sunset Manor was the longest 30 minutes of my life. Michael tried to make small talk about the weather, about how pretty the mountains looked with snow on them, about anything except what we were really doing. Susan sat in the passenger seat checking her phone, probably making sure all the paperwork was ready. When we pulled into the parking lot, I saw the building for the first time, and y'all, my heart just sank. It was nice enough, modern, clean, landscaped, but it looked exactly what it was, a place where families put elderly relatives when they don't want to deal with them anymore. The tour was conducted by a woman named Mrs. Henderson, and isn't that ironic, same name as my neighbor back home with the boyfriend, who was aggressively cheerful in that way that people are when they're trying to sell you something you don't want. She showed us the dining room with its institutional tables and chairs, the activity room where residents were sitting in wheelchairs watching a movie I couldn't hear, the cozy apartments that were smaller than my walk-in closet back home. "And this is where Dorothy would be living," Mrs. Henderson said, opening the door to a tiny one-bedroom apartment that smelled like disinfectant and sadness. It's one of our premium units with a lovely view of the garden. The view of the garden was a window that looked out onto a parking lot with a few struggling bushes around the edges. There was a single bed that looked like it belonged in a hospital, a small television mounted on the wall, and a bathroom so narrow I'd have to turn sideways to use it. "What do you think, Mom?" Michael asked, and I could hear the hope in his voice that I'd just give in, just make this easy for them. "I think," I said, and my voice came out steady even though my insides were shaking like leaves in a windstorm. "I think this is the most insulting thing anyone has ever done to me in my entire life." Mrs. Henderson's smile faltered for just a second before snapping back into place. Many of our residents feel overwhelmed at first, but once they settle in, they find that the community here becomes their new family. "I already have a family," I said, looking directly at Michael, or at least I thought I did. That's when Susan stepped in with her paperwork and her signatures and her efficient handling of what she clearly saw as a business transaction. Within an hour, I was officially a resident of Sunset Manor with the move-in date of the next morning. "We thought it would be easier to get you settled right away," Susan explained as we drove back to their house. "Your things from Phoenix will be delivered here in a few days, and we can help you decide what fits and what needs to go into storage." "I don't want to live there," I said one more time, but my voice sounded defeated even to my own ears. "Mom," Michael said, and he reached back to pat my hand like I was a dog that needed comforting. "You're going to love it once you give it a chance, and we'll visit all the time." But I knew they wouldn't. I knew that putting me in Sunset Manor was their way of solving the problem of what to do with an aging mother who had become inconvenient. I'd be tucked away, properly cared for by professionals, and they could go back to their lives without feeling guilty about abandoning me. That night, my last night in their house, I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to Sunset Manor. I wasn't going to let them pack up my life and store it in boxes like I was already dead. I was going home to Phoenix with or without their help. I waited until I heard them go to bed, and then I quietly gathered my things. I called a taxi. Remember when you could call a taxi without an app? And I asked the driver to take me to the airport. I figured I'd buy a ticket on the first flight to Phoenix and deal with the rest of my problems from there. But when we got to Denver International, I realized I'd made a tactical error. It was almost midnight, and most of the ticket counters were closed. The few that were open had flights that were either full or cost more money than I had in my checking account. So I found myself sitting in the airport, waiting for morning, waiting for the ticket counters to open, waiting to go home. That's when Michael found me. I don't know how he knew where I was. Maybe the taxi company called him when they couldn't get the credit card payment to go through, or maybe he just figured it out. But there he was at 5 in the morning, looking frantic and angry and hurt all at the same time. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked, sitting down in the uncomfortable plastic chair next to me. "I'm going home," I said simply. "I'm going back to Phoenix where I belong." "You can't just run away from this. Susan and I spent weeks planning this transition. We put down deposits, we signed contracts. We're trying to help you." "You're trying to get rid of me," I said. And finally, I said the truth that had been sitting in my chest like a stone. "You're ashamed of having an elderly mother, and you want to put me somewhere where I'm someone else's responsibility." "That's not true," Michael said, but he couldn't look at me when he said it. "Isn't it?" I asked. "When was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you visited Phoenix? When was the last time you acted like you actually wanted me in your life instead of just feeling obligated to take care of me?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at the departure board like it held answers to questions he didn't want to ask. Finally, he said, "I don't know how to do this, Mom. I don't know how to be the son of an aging parent. I don't know how to balance taking care of you with taking care of my own family." "You don't balance it," I said, and my voice was gentler than it had been in days. "You just love people and let them live their lives until they can't anymore. And sweetie, I can still live my life just fine." We sat there in those terrible airport chairs for another hour, talking more honestly than we had in years. He told me about his fears of something happening to me when I was alone in Phoenix. I told him about my fears of losing my independence, my identity, my whole sense of who I was as a person. We both cried a little, there in gate B47, surrounded by early morning travelers who were too polite or too tired to stare at the elderly woman and her middle-aged son having a family crisis at dawn. And that's when Susan showed up. She walked up to us with that determined stride of hers, her purse clutched in her hands like a weapon, her face set in lines of frustration and anger. "Michael," she said, not even acknowledging me, "we need to talk." "Susan," he said, standing up to face her, "maybe we should reconsider this whole thing." "Reconsider?" Her voice went up an octave. "We've put down deposits, we've signed contracts, we've arranged for her apartment to be packed up, we've done everything we can to make this transition smooth and easy, and now you want to reconsider because she throws a tantrum at the airport?" "I didn't throw a tantrum," I said, standing up too because I was tired of being talked about like I wasn't there. "I tried to go home because no one asked me what I wanted." "What you want isn't always what's best for you," Susan snapped. And there it was, the truth she'd been hiding behind her fake smiles and professional concern. "You're 73 years old. You live alone. You have no business making major life decisions without input from people who actually care about your welfare. People who care about my welfare would ask me what I want before making major life decisions for me." Girls, Michael said, trying to get between us, but Susan wasn't finished. "Do you know what it's been like having you in our house for 3 weeks?" she said, and her voice was rising enough that people were starting to stare. "You rearrange my kitchen. You try to parent my children. You act like you have opinions about how we run our household. You make me feel like a guest in my own home." "I was trying to help." "I don't want your help," Susan said. "And your help feels like criticism, and your love feels like interference." Y'all, that hit me like a slap across the face. Not because it was cruel, although it was, but because for the first time I understood what was really happening here. Susan wasn't just tired of having me around. She was threatened by me. She saw me as competition for Michael's attention, for the kids' affection, for her position as the woman who took care of this family. And maybe, just maybe, I had been acting like the mother-in-law she was afraid of. "Susan," I said, and I kept my voice calm even though my heart was pounding like a jackhammer. "I never meant to make you feel that way. I was just trying to be helpful because I love this family too." "Well, your help feels like criticism, and your love feels like interference." Michael was looking back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match, clearly wishing he was anywhere else in the world. But this was his family, his wife, and his mother, and he was going to have to choose sides, whether he wanted to or not. "Look," he said finally, "why don't we just all take a step back and figure this out rationally? Mom, you can't just live in Phoenix forever without any support system. Susan, we can't just ship Mom off to assisted living without considering other options. Maybe there's a middle ground here." "The middle ground," Susan said icily, "is exactly what we arranged. Professional care, medical support, social activities with people her own age. It's perfect." "For you. It's perfect for you because it gets me out of your hair and out of your house and out of your life." "Yes," Susan exploded. "Yes, it does. And I'm not going to apologize for wanting my life back. I'm 48 years old, Michael. I'm not ready to be a caregiver to your mother. I'm not ready to have 3 generations living in my house. I'm not ready to give up my privacy and independence so that your mother can avoid giving up hers." And there it was, laid out as plain as day. Susan wanted her life, and I wanted mine. And poor Michael was caught in the middle, trying to make everyone happy and succeeding in making no one happy.
"Okay," I said, and I sat back down in my plastic chair because suddenly I was exhausted. "Okay, let's talk about what everyone actually wants instead of what everyone thinks is best for everyone else." I looked at Susan, really looked at her, and saw a woman who was scared and frustrated and tired of feeling like a stranger in her own home. I looked at Michael and saw a man who loved both his wife and his mother and had no idea how to make that work. And I looked at myself and saw a stubborn old woman who was so afraid of losing her independence that she'd rather hurt her family than admit she might need help. "Susan," I said, "what would make you happy?" She looked surprised that I'd asked. "I want my house back," she said. "I want to feel like the woman of my own household again. I want to stop feeling like I'm being judged for every decision I make about my children or my home or my marriage." "Michael," I said, "what would make you happy?" "I want to know you're safe, Mom," he said. "I want to know that if something happens to you, someone will be there to help. I want to stop lying awake at night worrying about you being alone in Phoenix with no family nearby." "And what would make me happy," I said, "is to live my own life in my own home with my own friends, making my own decisions until I physically can't anymore. I don't want to be managed or handled or transitioned. I want to be trusted to know when I need help and asked before major decisions are made about my life." We sat there in that airport gate, the three of us, surrounded by travelers heading off to their own destinations, their own family dramas, their own complicated lives. And for the first time in weeks, we were all telling the truth. "So, how do we make all of that work?" Michael asked. "Maybe," I said slowly, "we stop trying to solve problems that don't exist yet. I'm healthy. I'm independent. I'm managing fine on my own. When that changes, if that changes, we can revisit the options then." "But what if something happens to you and we don't know?" Susan asked. And for the first time, she sounded genuinely concerned instead of just frustrated. "Then we set up systems," I said. "I check in with you every few days. I get one of those medical alert buttons. I let my neighbors know to keep an eye out for me. We don't have to solve every potential future problem right now." "And what about me feeling like a stranger in my own house when you visit?" Susan asked. "Maybe I don't visit for 3 weeks at a time. Maybe I come for long weekends. Or maybe you all come to visit me in Phoenix sometimes. Maybe we figure out how to be family without living in each other's pockets." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. And it was a solution that respected everyone's needs and fears instead of just steamrolling over them. But then Susan dropped the bomb that changed everything. "It's too late for that," she said quietly. "We've already terminated your lease in Phoenix. Your apartment is being packed up tomorrow." Y'all, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "You what?" "We thought you'd be settled at Sunset Manor by now," Michael said. "We thought you'd be happy there once you gave it a chance. You terminated my lease without asking me?" "We were trying to make the transition easier for you," Susan said, but she wouldn't look me in the eyes. "You destroyed my life without asking me." And my voice was loud enough that a security guard started walking in our direction. "Mom, we can fix this," Michael said quickly. "We can call your landlord. We can cancel the movers. We can figure something out." "Can we?" I asked. "Can you really? Because it sounds to me like you made irreversible decisions about my life, and now you're scrambling to undo them because you feel guilty." "That's exactly what we're doing," Susan said, and her honesty surprised me. "We made decisions we thought were best for everyone, and we were wrong. We should have talked to you first. We should have listened to what you wanted instead of deciding what we thought you needed." It was the first real apology I'd heard from either of them, and it meant more than all of Susan's professional efficiency or Michael's guilty explanations. "So what now?" I asked. "Now," Michael said, "we call your landlord and grovel. We call the moving company and cancel. We call Sunset Manor and forfeit our deposit. And we figure out a better way to be a family that respects everyone's independence." "And you'll let me go home to Phoenix?" I asked. "We'll drive you to the airport and put you on a plane ourselves," Susan said. But as it turned out, we didn't have to do that. Because while we were sitting there having our family therapy session at gate B47, I heard an announcement that changed everything. "Flight 447 to Phoenix has been delayed indefinitely due to mechanical problems. Passengers should check with gate agents for rebooking options." That's when Michael got that look on his face that meant I wasn't going to like what he was about to suggest. "Mom, this might be a sign," he said. "Maybe you should come back to the house and we can sort all this out properly. Call your landlord, cancel the movers, make sure everything's handled correctly before you go back. Or," Susan said, and I could see her thinking, "you could stay at our house while we figure out a long-term solution that works for everyone. Not as a permanent arrangement, just while we get your Phoenix situation sorted out." "You want me to come back to your house?" I asked Susan. "After everything that was just said here?" "I want to do this right," she said.
I want to stop acting out of fear and frustration and start acting like the family we're supposed to be, even if that means being uncomfortable for a while until we figure it out. So that's how I found myself back in their guest room for what we all agreed would be exactly 1 week while we sorted out the mess they'd made of my life. And y'all, that week turned out to be completely different from the 3 weeks that came before it. For starters, we talked to each other, really talked. Susan told me about how overwhelmed she'd been feeling trying to manage her own life while also worrying about me. I told her about how invisible and unwanted I'd felt in her house. Michael admitted that he'd been avoiding dealing with any of it by just going along with whoever was talking to him last. We set up ground rules. I wouldn't rearrange Susan's kitchen or offer unsolicited advice about the kids or the house. Susan wouldn't make major decisions about my life without discussing them with me first. Michael wouldn't try to avoid conflict by just going along with whoever was talking to him last. And slowly, carefully, we started to actually enjoy each other's company. I taught Emma how to make my chocolate chip cookies with Susan's permission and in Susan's kitchen, but following Susan's rules about cleaning up as we went along. Susan showed me how to use her fancy coffee maker that made better coffee than anything I had in Phoenix. Michael and I went to a Broncos game together, just the two of us, and talked about everything except living arrangements and future care plans. The kids, it turned out, had been picking up on all the tension between the adults and responding by withdrawing. Once we stopped walking around on eggshells, they relaxed too. Josh started telling me about his soccer team. Emma started asking about my bridge club friends. They weren't avoiding me anymore because the grown-ups had stopped treating me like a problem to be solved.
Meanwhile, we were working on the practical stuff. Michael called my landlord in Phoenix and explained the situation. The man was remarkably understanding. Apparently, his own mother had been through something similar with his sister and agreed to let me keep my apartment with just a month's penalty fee. The movers were more expensive to cancel, but we managed that too. By the end of the week, I had a plane ticket back to Phoenix. My apartment was still mine, and my family felt like a family again instead of a collection of people managing a crisis. But the real revelation came on my last night there. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when Susan came and sat down next to me. "Dot," she said, and she was calling me Mom again, which warmed my heart more than I expected. "I owe you a real apology." "You already apologized at the airport," I said. "No, I apologize for the practical stuff, for making decisions without you, for trying to ship you off to assisted living, but I need to apologize for something bigger than that." I put my book down and looked at her. "You were treating me like a threat instead of like family," she said. "I was so afraid that you'd come into my house and take over, or that Michael would choose you over me, or that the kids would like you better than they liked me, that I never gave you a chance to just be Josh and Emma's grandmother." "I wasn't exactly making it easy for you," I said. "I was acting like I knew better than you about your own family." "Maybe," she said, "but that doesn't excuse how I handled it. I should have talked to you about my concerns instead of going behind your back to solve what I saw as the problem of you." We sat there for a minute, both of us thinking about the month we'd just been through. "I have an idea," Susan said. "What if instead of long visits that stress everyone out, you came for long weekends? Once a month, maybe twice if there's something special happening. You'd have your own life in Phoenix. We'd have our life here, but we'd have regular time together that everyone could look forward to instead of endure." "That sounds perfect," I said. "And what if when you do come to visit, you stayed in a hotel instead of in our guest room? Not because we don't want you here, but because it might be easier for everyone to have some space and privacy." That sounds even better, because honestly, their guest bed was terrible for my back. And what if we all came to visit you in Phoenix sometimes? See your world, meet your friends, let the kids experience something different from suburban Colorado. I would love that more than anything, I said, and I meant it. So that's how we worked it out, y'all. Not with assisted living facilities or family meetings or professional intervention, but with honest conversation and mutual respect and a willingness to try something different. I've been back in Phoenix for 3 months now, and it's working. Susan and I text each other pictures, her garden, my bridge club, the kids' school activities, my morning coffee group. Michael calls me once a week just to talk, not to check up on me or manage my life, but because he actually wants to know how I'm doing. I've been back to Denver twice for long weekends, staying at a nice hotel near their house, and both visits were lovely. We're planning for them to come here for Easter. But here's the thing that really changed everything. And this is the part that's going to make you understand why that terrible day at the airport was actually the best thing that ever happened to us. Last month, I was having coffee with Mrs. Peterson. Remember her, my Tuesday coffee friend? When she told me something that made my blood run cold. Her daughter had just moved her into one of those assisted living places, very similar to Sunset Manor. And honey, the story she told me would curl my hair. Dot, she said, her voice shaking like autumn leaves. They treat us like children there. They have schedules for when we eat, when we sleep, when we can have visitors. They monitor our phone calls to make sure we're not getting confused about our finances. They go through our mail. And the worst part? Once you sign those papers, once your family puts you there, it's almost impossible to leave. She told me about Mr. Williams, who had been trying for 6 months to move back to his own apartment, but his son with power of attorney wouldn't sign the release papers. She told me about Miss Chen, whose daughter had sold her house while she was temporarily staying at the facility, leaving her with nowhere to go even if she could leave. Y'all, I sat there listening to her stories, and I realized how close I had come to losing everything. Not just my independence, not just my apartment, but my entire identity as a person capable of making my own decisions. If I hadn't run to that airport that day, and if I hadn't forced that terrible but necessary confrontation, I would be sitting in some institutional dining room right now, eating scheduled meals and participating in mandatory activities and slowly forgetting who I used to be. But it gets worse. Mrs. Peterson told me that her daughter had done exactly what Susan and Michael had tried to do to me. She convinced me it was temporary, just until we could figure out the best long-term solution. She packed up my apartment, put my things in storage, and told me it was all reversible. But honey, once your lease is broken and your utilities are canceled and your address is changed with Social Security and Medicare, it becomes almost impossible to go back. The system is designed to keep you where you are once you're in it. That's when I understood the real brilliance of Susan's plan and why it had been so important for me to fight it when I did. She hadn't been trying to temporarily transition me to assisted living. She had been trying to permanently relocate my entire life, piece by piece, in a way that would make it financially and practically impossible for me to return to Phoenix, even if I wanted to. The lease termination, the movers, the address changes, the facility deposits, it had all been designed to create a situation where going along with their plan would be easier than fighting it. And for most elderly people in my situation, it would have worked exactly as intended. I called Michael that night and I asked him directly, "Son, if I had gone into Sunset Manor that day and if I had hated it, would you have helped me get back out?" There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Finally, he said, "Mom, I don't know. the deposits were non-refundable, your apartment would have been gone, and Susan was pretty convinced that you'd be happier there once you adjusted. So the answer is no, I said. The answer is probably no, he admitted. Once we'd made all those changes, it would have been really hard to undo them. Y'all, that conversation haunted me for days. Not because I was angry at Michael, he was being honest, which I appreciated, but because I realized how many elderly people must be sitting in facilities right now, not because they need intensive care, but because their families made irreversible decisions during moments of panic or frustration. I started volunteering at a senior center here in Phoenix, and honey, the stories I hear there would break your heart. So many people who are physically and mentally capable of independent living, but who got railroaded into institutional care during crises and never found their way back out.
There's Martha, whose son moved her into assisted living after she had a minor car accident. She's been trying to get her driver's license reinstated for 2 years, but the facility doctor won't clear her for independent living because she lacks family support, meaning her son won't agree to let her leave. There's Frank, whose daughter put him in memory care after he got confused about his medications once. He's sharp as a tack, sharper than most people half his age, but the facility won't release him because his daughter has convinced them he has dementia that comes and goes. There's Helen, whose family moved her into assisted living temporarily after her husband died, telling her it was just until she could process her grief and make rational decisions about her future. That was 3 years ago, and every time she brings up moving back to independent living, they tell her she's not ready yet. The system, y'all, is designed to keep families happy and facilities profitable, not to respect the autonomy and dignity of elderly people. And once you're in it, getting out requires resources and support that most people in those situations don't have. But here's the beautiful part of my story, the part that makes me grateful every single day for that terrible confrontation at Denver International Airport. My family learned from our crisis instead of just managing it. 2 weeks after Mrs. Peterson told me her story, I called a family meeting, not a crisis intervention, not an emergency response to some problem, but a planned, thoughtful conversation about how we wanted to handle aging and independence and family support. I flew to Denver, staying at my hotel, of course, and we all sat down at Susan's kitchen table with coffee and homemade cookies and actual respect for each other's perspectives. I want to talk about the future, I said, not because there's a crisis right now, but because I want us to make decisions together before there is a crisis. I told them about Mrs. Peterson and her stories. I told them about the volunteers at the senior center and their experiences. I told them about how close we had all come to making irreversible decisions based on fear and frustration instead of love and respect. I want you to promise me something, I said to Michael and Susan. I want you to promise that you will never again make major decisions about my life without involving me in the conversation. Not if I'm sick, not if I'm scared, not if you think you know what's best for me. What if you're not capable of making rational decisions anymore? Susan asked. What if you have dementia? Or what if you're in the hospital and confused? Or what if there really is an emergency where we have to act quickly? Then you make the minimum decisions necessary to keep me safe, and you reverse them as soon as I'm capable of participating in the conversation again. You don't use a temporary crisis as an excuse to make permanent changes to my life. We spent the whole weekend working out what that would look like in practice. We talked about power of attorney, not the kind that lets them make any decision they want, but the kind that specifies exactly what decisions they can make and under what circumstances. We talked about living wills and healthcare directives and financial planning.
But most importantly, we talked about the difference between helping someone and controlling them. The difference, I told them, is whether you ask me what I want or tell me what you've decided. The difference is whether you give me options or present me with accomplished facts. The difference is whether you respect my right to make bad decisions or assume that I'm not capable of making any decisions. Susan asked me the question I'd been waiting for. But what if you make a decision that we think is dangerous? What if you decide to keep driving when we think you shouldn't, or keep living alone when we think you need help? Then you tell me your concerns. You offer to help me find solutions. You ask me to consider alternatives. But ultimately, you accept that it's my life and my risk to take as long as I'm mentally competent to make that choice. And what if we can't live with the worry? What if we're lying awake at night, terrified that something's going to happen to you and we won't know until it's too late? Then you figure out ways to stay connected and informed that don't require controlling my life. You call more often, you visit more regularly, you help me set up support systems in Phoenix. But you don't solve your worry by taking away my freedom. It was a hard conversation, y'all, but it was necessary. And it led to some practical solutions that have made all of us feel more secure. I got one of those medical alert systems, not because they insisted on it, but because I decided it was a reasonable precaution. I gave them the name and contact information from my doctor, my neighbors, and my closest friends in Phoenix. I agreed to check in with them by phone twice a week, not for them to monitor me, but for us to stay connected. In return, they agreed to respect my independence unless there was a genuine medical emergency that left me unable to make decisions for myself. They agreed to discuss any concerns with me directly instead of making plans behind my back, and they agreed to support my choices even when those choices worried them. The real test of our new system came last month, when I had a minor medical scare that could have triggered all our old patterns. I was at the grocery store, Safeway, not Walmart, because I like their produce section better, when I started feeling dizzy and nauseous. Instead of trying to drive myself home, I called 911 like a sensible person, and they took me to the emergency room where they determined I was having a reaction to a new blood pressure medication. The old Michael and Susan would have gotten that phone call from the hospital and immediately started making plans to move me into assisted living for my own safety. The new Michael and Susan called me at the hospital, made sure I was okay, asked me what I needed from them, and waited for me to tell them how they could help me. When I got home the next day, my phone was ringing with concerned family members ready to rush to Phoenix and start managing my life. Instead, I had a calm conversation with Michael about what had happened, what the doctor had said, and what changes I was making to prevent it from happening again. "Do you need us to come out there?" he asked. "Not unless you want to visit," I said. "I'm handling this fine on my own, but I appreciate you asking." "Are you sure? It would be no problem for Susan and me to fly out for a few days just to make sure you're okay." "I'm sure. But thank you for offering to help instead of just showing up with a U-Haul truck." He laughed at that, and I could hear the relief in his voice. Relief that I was okay, yes, but also relief that we had learned how to be a family in crisis without destroying each other's autonomy and dignity. The kids have been part of this transformation too. Emma, who's now 16 and too cool to admit she likes spending time with her grandmother, texts me pictures of her art projects and asks for advice about boys that she would never ask her parents about. Josh, who's 14 and obsessed with basketball, calls me after games to tell me about his best plays and his worst mistakes. They're not avoiding me anymore because the grown-ups aren't treating me like a problem to be solved. They see me as a person they can have real relationships with, not just someone they have to be polite to during awkward family visits. And Susan and I have developed something I never expected, an actual friendship.
She calls me for advice about work problems, not because she has to maintain a relationship with her husband's mother, but because she's discovered that I'm actually pretty good at listening and offering practical suggestions. I call her when I need help with technology or when I want someone to vent to about the politics at my bridge club. We've even started planning a girls' trip together, just Susan and me, going to Las Vegas for a long weekend to see some shows and gamble away small amounts of money and drink cocktails by the pool. The woman who once saw me as a threat to her marriage is now someone I genuinely enjoy spending time with. But the most important change is in how we talk about the future. We don't pretend that I'm going to stay healthy and independent forever. We don't avoid conversations about what will happen as I get older, but we approach those conversations as a team, working together to solve future problems, not as adversaries fighting over control. Last month, we toured some senior living communities in Phoenix, not because I need them now, but because I wanted to know what my options would be if and when I do need more support. We looked at places that offered different levels of care, from independent living apartments to full nursing care, so that I could age in place instead of having to start over somewhere new every time my needs changed. We also researched home care options so that I could potentially stay in my own apartment longer with professional help coming to me instead of me going to institutional care. The difference is that I'm making these decisions while I'm healthy and clear-minded, with full information about my options and full control over the timeline. I'm not making them in the middle of a crisis with family members who are panicked and facilities that are pressuring me to sign papers immediately. I've even written out detailed instructions about what I want if I develop dementia or other conditions that affect my decision-making ability. Not just medical directives, but specific instructions about my living situation, my daily routines, the things that are important to maintaining my sense of self, even if my mind starts to fail. And here's the thing that makes me most proud of my family. They listened to those instructions, they asked thoughtful questions about them, and they promised to honor them, even when, especially when, honoring them might be more difficult than just putting me in the most convenient facility. "We want you to still be you," Susan told me, "even if you need help remembering who you are." Y'all, I cried when she said that because it meant that all of us had learned the most important lesson from our airport crisis, that taking care of someone doesn't mean taking over their life, and that loving someone doesn't mean assuming you know better than they do about what makes them happy. Now, I know some of you listening to this story are probably thinking that I was lucky. Lucky that my family was willing to admit they were wrong. Lucky that we were able to work things out. Lucky that I had the resources and stubbornness to fight for my independence when it was threatened. And you're right, I was incredibly lucky. But I also want you to know that luck wasn't the only factor here. Standing up for myself at that airport, refusing to go along with decisions that were being made without my input, insisting on being treated as an adult capable of making my own choices, those weren't lucky accidents. Those were choices I made, even when making those choices was difficult and uncomfortable and risked damaging relationships with people I loved. A lot of elderly people in my situation would have gone along with the Sunset Manor plan because it seemed easier than fighting it. They would have told themselves that their families knew best, or that they didn't want to cause trouble, or that maybe institutional living wouldn't be so bad once they got used to it. But I knew that giving up my independence before I absolutely had to would mean giving up the person I had spent 73 years becoming. And I wasn't ready to do that just to make other people's lives more convenient. If you're listening to this story and you're facing similar pressure from well-meaning family members, I want you to know that you have the right to make your own decisions about your life
as long as you're mentally and physically capable of doing so. You don't owe anyone gratitude for arrangements you didn't agree to. You don't have to accept help that feels more like control than care. And if you're listening to this story and you're the adult child of an aging parent, I want you to understand that your worry about your parents' safety doesn't give you the right to make major life decisions for them without their consent. Your love for them doesn't mean you know better than they do about what makes them happy. Your desire to help them doesn't justify taking away their autonomy and dignity. The conversation needs to happen while everyone is still healthy and clear-minded. The plans need to be made together, not imposed by the people with the most power in the relationship. The goal needs to be supporting your parents' independence for as long as possible, not finding the earliest excuse to take it away. 3 months ago, I was sitting in that terrible plastic chair at gate B47, feeling abandoned and betrayed and scared that my whole life was about to be packed up and stored away like I was already dead. Today, I'm living in my own apartment, making my own decisions, maintaining my own relationships, and looking forward to a future that I have some control over. The difference isn't that I got lucky. The difference is that I refused to accept other people's definitions of what was best for me, and I fought for the right to define that for myself. My son Michael called me yesterday to tell me that Josh had made the varsity basketball team and Emma had gotten the lead in the school play. We talked for 30 minutes about normal family things: his job, Susan's garden, my bridge club drama, the weather in Colorado versus the weather in Arizona. At the end of the call, he said something that made my heart sing. "Thanks for calling, Mom. I love you." Not, "Thanks for checking in so we know you're okay." Not, "Be careful and call if you need anything." Just, "I love you." Like I was a person he enjoyed talking to instead of a responsibility he had to manage. That's what fighting for my independence really gave me back. Not just the right to live my own life, but the chance to have real relationships with my family based on love and choice instead of obligation and control. And honey, that was worth every uncomfortable minute of that airport confrontation and every difficult conversation that followed. So, the next time someone tells you to stay put and wait for them to come back and handle your life for you, remember my story. Remember that you have the right to get up from that chair, walk to the ticket counter, and book your own flight home. Remember that your age doesn't disqualify you from making your own decisions, and other people's worry about you doesn't give them the right to control you. Most importantly, remember that the people who truly love you will respect your choices, even when those choices worry them. And the people who can't respect your choices might love you, but they don't love you enough to let you be yourself. I'm still Dorothy, still living in Phoenix, still having coffee with Mrs. Peterson on Tuesdays and playing bridge on Thursdays and making my own chocolate chip cookies whenever I feel like it. I'm still calling my son once a week and texting with my daughter-in-law about everything and nothing and planning visits that we all look forward to.
The only difference is that now I know my family sees me as a person, not a problem. They see me as someone whose happiness matters, not just someone whose safety needs to be managed. They see me as someone who has wisdom and experience to offer, not just someone who needs to be taken care of. And y'all, that makes all the difference in the world. So remember, you're never too old to stand up for yourself. You're never too dependent to deserve respect. And you're never too much trouble to be loved for who you are, instead of managed for who other people think you should become. That's my story, honey, and I'm sticking to it.
Now tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were sitting in that airport chair? Because I have a feeling there are a lot of you out there who have your own stories about family, independence, and the courage it takes to insist on being treated like the adult you've always been. Until next time, this is Dorothy, reminding you that growing older doesn't mean growing smaller. It just means growing wiser about what's worth fighting for. And family that respects you, that's always worth fighting for.